There is no moral equivalence between what the Russian army is doing and what the Ukrainian army is doing, even though they're both flawed in many ways, but there's a very clear, right, need and value to, in some sense, in some deep sense, support Ukraine in the best way possible. It's clearly true in Israel, right? In other words, Israel is a flourishing democracy. I'm going to end with how I began, with Hadassah Hospital and pluralism, which has a code of ethics for its army, lived by even now in the middle of the horror. Right? Warnings were given in Gaza to evacuate places where the army was going to operate. Without establishing a field of value in which value is real, number one, and there's a shared ground of value, a shared grammar of value, and that there's some sense in which that value is not just made up, it's not just a political creation, it's not just a social construction, but actually we align with value. Value lives in us. We have to listen deeply and clarify our interior to actually listen to the voice of value to which we have direct access. And we can actually trust our direct access to that value that lives inside, and that value lives inside every human being. And we can actually listen to that voice of value and trust it as it moves in us, as the mysteries live within us. Without that possibility, without that shared ground of value in which we participate, which lives in us, as us, and through us, value which both evolves through us and at the same time value before which we bow, right? We bow before value, or we bow before the mystery. We encounter the mystery, and the mystery incarnates as value, as goodness, as truth, right? As beauty, as the field of ethos and eros, which is one. Because what eros means is the experience of radical aliveness, seeking, desiring deeper contact and greater wholeness. Right? That's what eros is. And that means that eros and ethics are the same thing. Ethics is the experience of radical aliveness, seeking, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness. That's what ethos is. So there's no split between eros and ethos. And we're committed to creating, to generating, to fostering, to supporting a field of eros and ethos that supports all of life. That is the ground for any conversation. Without that ground, we can't have a conversation. There are better and worse expressions of eros and ethos. There's not moral equivalence, right? You can't just erase distinctions and erase any notion of distinction. Can't do that. You have to be willing to do the deep work of collecting truth. And truth, yes, there are multiple perspectives. When people have an argument, there are a bunch of perspectives in an argument, but there's not infinite perspectives, right? You have to actually collect information, facts. It's got to be facts. Right? Facts means there's something that's real. There's something that's empirical, that's checkable. Right? When you're on the playground and the bully punches you and you punch back, there's a distinction between the punching back and the original punch. They're not the same. How things come about. When someone comes into your house, right, to rape your daughter, and you defend your daughter and you kill them because that was the only way to save your daughter, that's not murder, but that's something else. That is killing in defense of a field of value. I had a long conversation on this topic, right? Well, not that long, but a moderately long conversation with the Dalai Lama when I was in Dharamsala. And we talked about this notion of utter moral equivalence and how devastating it is. There's not moral equivalences. There's a gentleman who writes in the United States who I have not tracked closely. I've listened to 5 or 6 of his presentations and take issue with some very, very core assumptions that he makes that I think are flawed. His name is Sam Harris. But on one issue, I think he's done a brilliant job. And this is actually where I encountered his work, where he did the completely audacious thing, maybe it was a decade ago, of challenging Islam and challenging this notion of moral equivalence, in which you weren't allowed to critique the way Islam was expressing itself in the world. And Sam was right. The fact is, and this is a tragic fact, but a true fact, is that this is point 3, every religion has its texts that it should be embarrassed of. That's true. Every religion has shadow. That's absolutely true. And a religion needs to evolve in accordance with its own values in order to align with the broader field of value. So what do I mean by that? So if in the Torah, for example, which is the sacred text of Judaism, there are a set of texts that talk about when the Israelites conquer ancient Canaan, right? There's a kind of injunction, kill everyone. That's tragic. And that was the nature of the ancient world. And so, a few hundred years later, right, several thousand years ago already, about 2,500 years ago, the readers of that text said that text cannot be fulfilled because we can no longer in this world identify anyone by their place of origin. And so the Talmud, 3rd century, says, at a particular moment in time, it marks that moment in time as the Assyrian kingdom, you can no longer identify a person by their place of origin. So none of the texts from the ancient world that suggest that you can attack a person based on their racial source are valid. They are all nullified. All those texts are nullified. And that was the fundamental position, right, of the Talmud in nullifying, right, any text that would allow for distinction in moral treatment based on racial origin. Christianity has tragic texts in the book of John, right, which were used by Goebbels, right, in World War II. Goebbels, the minister of propaganda for Nazism. And Christianity has evolved and said no to those texts and rejected those texts, right, and actually stood for, right, a wider and more beautiful and deeper world. Christianity has gone through a profound evolution. And yes, there are shadow forms of Christianity, and there are shadow forms of Christian theology, and there's dimensions of Judaism that need to be evolved and transformed evermore. But both Christianity and Judaism have, at the very core of their establishments, gone through an experience of what I would call the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of love, which caused texts to be challenged and up-leveled and evolved and transformed in a very fundamental way. In other words, let me just say it a little differently. Judaism and Christianity interpenetrated their experiences of waking up to an experience of the divine, to an experience of ethos, with a second experience, which was an experience of growing up to higher and higher levels of consciousness, so that they began to reject texts. The current Pope For example, the current Catholic Pope, right, has made a very strong position of moving towards, right, a sense of, right, long overdue in the Catholic Church, maybe 1,000 years overdue or more, maybe 1,700 years overdue, but towards, right, a deep evolution, right, and transformation of consciousness. Tragically, the most dominant forces in international realpolitik, which root themselves in Islam, and Islam in general, has not gone through that same interpenetration with values of universal sisterhood, universal brotherhood, the emergence of the feminine, the dignity of the body, universal human rights. That hasn't happened. Right? The experience of Islam interpenetrating with a kind of enlightenment, a renaissance, the kind of the values that emerged from the Renaissance, the positive values, right, of universal sisterhood and universal brotherhood, that actually didn't happen. When Sam Harris pointed this out in his own form, and I read maybe one article that he wrote about it, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was a long time ago, he got brutally attacked by the emergent woke communities. But Sam was right. It's actually correct. So let's just be really clear. The movement and even reporting what's happening in Israel, and this is, I don't know what point we're up to, let's call this point 5. So I'm just going to give you one example. I read the Boston Globe at about 5 a.m. this morning. And the Boston Globe describes, right, what happened as this kind of moral equivalent, right, battle between the Hamas fighters and the Israeli soldiers. And then it describes how the Hamas fighters, right, went and rampaged through Israeli communities, right, including a nature festival, right, in the south of Israel. So let me be clear. Hamas fighters were not rampaging, right, through Israel, meaning rampaging, meaning breaking windows and even roughing people up a little bit. No, that's not what they were doing, right? The tragically educated and horrifically twisted culture of Hamas, which basically views people outside of Der al-Harb, of the nation of Islam, as being those who are subject to destruction by the sword. For example, entered a nature festival with thousands of Israeli kids, teenagers, and basically massacred them. Massacred hundreds of kids. Butchered and massacred. They didn't rampage. Right? They sought the most vulnerable civilian populations and went and rampaged and massacred, and then went into houses and massacred families, men, women, children, with intention. Right? That's been actually part of the fundamental methodology of Hamas. They didn't rampage. This is not a moral equivalence story. And I am deeply aware, deeply aware of the complexity of the Middle East. I lived in Israel for many, many years, number one. Number two, I lived in a home in Jaffa, in Arab Jaffa, with an Arab family, with great love and delight. Right? Number three, I've taken, major stands in Israel about how we need to work and coexist, right, and share, right, and create a shared sense of value with our Arab brothers and sisters. That's all true. That's all true. And if you follow and trace carefully, get beneath the news, right, read, right, real grounding documents and trace the storyline of how this is developed, which I can't do in this short presentation, you will understand the following. Israel is, with all of its complexity, with all of its tragedy, with all of its imperfections, of which it has many, a thriving democracy, right, based on a sense of universal human rights. Hadassah Hospital at the center of Jerusalem, which is grounded in the ethos of the Israeli democracy, serves every Jew and Arab that will enter, with Jewish and Arab doctors working side by side. There was a reason it was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. There is tragically no other capital other than Israeli Jerusalem that would actually allow for the existence of a Hadassah hospital where you could go in and know that you would be treated fairly and beautifully and gorgeously with devotion. Right? That would not happen in any Arab capital, any place in the Middle East. And certainly there'd be zero chance of that taking place any place within the province and realm of Hamas. Let's just understand that, right? The Hamas-Iran nexus, whose overt covenant is dedicated to the annihilation, right, of Israel, would never allow for a Hadassah hospital. That's a joke. But Israel does. And the failure, right, to actually distinguish between these different structures and levels of consciousness, right, is utterly destructive. So when I open, right, I must have read this morning 5 or 6 accounts in different mainstream outlets of the Western press, and I see, right, things like, right, Hamas fighters rampaged in an Israeli festival. No, they didn't rampage in an Israeli festival. They massacred hundreds of high school students. Those are not the same. And if we trace the history of this story, and I've spent, thousands of hours tracing the history of how the story began, let's say over the last 100 years, right? Since maybe the last 150 years. What's very, very clear is the following, and I'll make it very, very clear. I'm going to try and summarize it. The overwhelming majority of the Israeli population has been willing time and again to make peace, right, and to share the space and to share the land, right, in some appropriate way. Within this arena, without going through all the history right now, there are 21, 22 Arab states with vast amounts of lands and reserves. There's one tiny Jewish state. That Jewish state itself, right, has been willing, right, to make 1,000 compromises for the sake of peace. And there has not been an ethical, stable partner for peace on the other side. That's simply true. That's an undeniable fact, right? And if you contest that fact, you actually have not traced the story. Simply, there have to be facts. There's got to be some ground of fact. That's true. Again and again and again, left-wing Israeli governments, right-wing Israeli governments, and when someone in Israel or a group of people in Israel violate the basic shared ethical values of human rights, including Arab human rights, right? Remember Hadassah Hospital. If you read, for example, right, the Charter of Ethics of the Israeli Army, prepared by Professor Asa Kasher and others in Israel, you will read one of the most profoundly shocking, gorgeous ethical documents ever written in human history. And that's the aspiration of the Israeli army. And when someone violates that, they're court-martialed, they're sent to prison. Yes, the system breaks down at times. Yes, there are aberrations. There are always aberrations. But those aberrations are the exception to a very strong rule, which the overwhelming majority, right, of the Israeli population holds. By contrast, tragically, right, on the street that's controlled by Hamas in Gaza, for example, just as one example, when someone sees an Israeli car sees children in the back seats, shoots into the car at the children, at the parents, and kills them, as has happened time and again, happened to people in my family, happened to me driving a car with my child in the back seat, although I managed to get out at that particular time, right? That's standard practice to become a martyr, right? That person becomes not an outcast, right, but a hero. Now, again, this is not because Israel has a powerful army and there's this weak and disempowered, and the only method they have of political discourse is terrorism for Hamas. That's not the case, right? The reason this situation exists is because Hamas has incarnated, right, a utter rejection of the fundamental values of universal human rights, the fundamental values of universal fairness, the fundamental values of the honor of the feminine, the fundamental values of fact-checking and truth, the fundamental values of, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on, right? And based on that rejection, and based on the distortion of Eros, which expresses itself in a distorted love story, a tragically distorted love story, in which love means not even love of my people, not only just love of my people, it's much worse than that. Love means I love only my people, but I love only my people who adhere to a very particular and narrow interpretation, right, of the law of the prophet. And that narrow interpretation of the law of the prophet has to include utter commitment to the annihilation of the state of Israel, which is in the very core charter of Hamas. And if you don't adhere to that, or if you assert, for example, the independent integrity and autonomy, right, of the feminine, independent of its service to the masculine, which is all, this is all in the charter, right, of Hamas. If you reject that, you're in violation of the law of the prophet. So, for example, honor killing, right, killing a woman, right, who is suspect of having, quote unquote, fooled around with someone, right, is completely legitimate. And no evidence needs to be brought that the woman was actually in violation of this ostensible moral turpitude. One merely says one was engaged in honor killing. Check out, there's an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of empirical data gathered on how honor killings happen. Or if a man, right, in the world of Hamas has proclivities towards being gay. So there's a major Hamas leader killed a bunch of years ago for being gay. Killed in a brutal, horrific, torturing way. So Hamas represents, right, the cruelties, the shadow of a medieval world in its most brutal forms. So we can't skip this, my friends. We can't skip this. We can't go to moral equivalence. And I know this is going to be for some people an unpopular position. But if we can't actually stand for a shared grammar of value, then the whole thing collapses. Friends, there is a battle between good and evil. And we do need to take a stand in that battle. And it's not all realpolitik. And it's not all corrupt. And it's not true that it's just corruption all around. Yes, there's corruption in every system. And there's no system that's not without its deep flaws. But there is better and worse. And there's higher and more degraded forms of value. And there is, I want to say it again, there's a battle between good and evil. And that's real. And we need to take our stand in that battle. And it's not a moral equivalence all around. Right? There's not a moral equivalence between the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. And I'm familiar, very deeply familiar with all the flaws and complexities that are happening in the Ukraine. I'm aware of that. Right? And there is no moral equivalence between what the Russian army is doing and what the Ukrainian army is doing, even though they're both flawed in many ways. But there's a very clear, right, need and value to, in some sense, in some deep sense, support Ukraine in the best way possible. And that's true. right? With all the complexity. It's clearly true in Israel, right? In other words, Israel is, right, is a flourishing democracy. I'm going to end with how I began, with Hadassah Hospital and pluralism, right at the very center of the society. It's this tiny little country, right, which has a code of ethics for its army that is the most advanced code of ethics. It's an aspirational code, right, that the army strives and stretches to live by even now in the middle of the horror. Right? Warnings were given in Gaza to evacuate places where the army was going to operate. The whole thing's imperfect. The whole thing's holy and broken, hallelujah. But there is a battle between good and evil. And we can trust, right, our deepest heart's desire, which incarnates our moral compass. And we do need to be telling a new story of desire and a new story of value. And we need to actually be madly committed to that story. And we need to stake our lives on it. And we need to be willing to bracket our narcissistic selves for the sake of the larger whole. And that's what arouses the respect of reality itself. Right? Wow. We can't have Hamas hijack God. Right? Hamas can't hijack God. The God of Hamas is a distorted and degraded God, which is idolatrous, which serves tragically, right, the degraded forms of the great impulse of goodness that is the spark that's at the heart, the original heart of every great system of value, of every great system of religion, of religare, of reconnecting. But as Abraham Cook writes, when you degrade your vision of God, you degrade your vision of ethos. And very quickly, you become a mass murderer. Right? There is a great battle between good and evil. And our role in that battle here in One Mountain is we are going to give everything we have, with every breath we have, not as a casual side activity, not as a hobby as we do our narcissistic lives. We're going to lay it down, right, to tell a new story of value, not just to tell it, not just to declare it. You know, Barbara Marx Hubbard, it's so good to have you with us here. And you began this with us. And Sally Kempton, right, the two great women who held the center for so many years and who held this vision of value. Right? So I just want to invoke them and invoke the dignity of that feminine and the great women and men who hold the center, right, in all of their positions of leadership. Right? We are committed to actually writing with depth a great library and to grounding it in the deepest sciences and the deepest footnotes and the deepest universal grammars of value, liberating the deepest sparks from every great tradition and creating the ground of a world religion as a context for our diversity, where there's a place for a gorgeous, holy Islam, a gorgeous, holy Judaism, a gorgeous, holy Buddhism, gorgeous, holy Sunnis and Shiites, right? Where the tragedy of Islam is that within Islam, right, murder reigns between every faction. No, let's have a shared value within Islam, a shared Christ field. Right? We're committed to this. We're going to do everything we can to articulate in every language we can, right, this new grammar of value and to validate it, not just to claim it, to validate it. That's not a two-year project. That's our life's work. We're gonna try and publish it and write it and film it and share it in every way we can. And that's our fight. But we're fighting. We're fighting. We're in the great battle of good and evil. And lastly, and with this we end. This is our amen, friends. This is our amen. We have to actually own the shadow in us, right? The only way to be in the great battle of good and evil is to know that it's not just binary. Any evil that exists out there in some place lurks in my heart. And so I have to find that inside of me and transform it. We say in the text of Solomon, greater is light than darkness. And then the masters say in the 13th century, not greater is light than darkness, greater is light that comes from the darkness. We have to own our own shadows. We have to own our own flaws. We have to own our own vulnerabilities, but not with a sense of moral equivalence. Not, oh, right, we're all flawed and vulnerable. No, there are distinctions, and they're important distinctions. But we never make evil solely the place where the other lives. Right? We always look deeply. We're willing to be displeasing to ourselves, because it's only by being displeasing to ourselves that we can be an altar to the divine, an altar to the Christ, an altar to the true Allah, an altar to the true Atman, that is Brahman, an altar to the true Adonai Elohim.